Welcome to today's podcast, New Cyber Risks for Nonprofits, Strategies for Protecting Your Organization. My name is Jason Q. I'm a staff attorney at the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. We provide free legal services and training to nonprofit organizations in Washington, DC. Today's podcast is part of a series that focuses on practical challenges that nonprofits face on a regular basis. On our website, you can also find a trove of webinars, newsletters, legal alerts, and other resources covering a wide range of nonprofit legal issues. That website is linked up on the top of your page. It's lawhelp.org/DC/CED. So today's topic is new cyber risks for nonprofits. Our guest on the podcast today is Matt McLellan. Matt is a senior vice president and a broker at Marsh, where he advises clients on a wide range of risk management and insurance coverage matters. Matt has also practiced as an insurance coverage attorney in both private practice and as in-house counsel. He recently volunteered for us as a trainer for our Board Basics intensive course for nonprofit board members, and we're very happy to have him back for our podcast today. Hi, Matt. How's it going?
Hey, Jason. How are you? Happy to be here this afternoon.
Good. We're happy to have you. So our topic today is new cyber risks for nonprofits, but I should admit that's a little inaccurate because I think nonprofits have been affected by cyber risks for a long time. But in my experience, many nonprofits and their boards have not thought through too intensively about the kinds of cyber risks that they might be vulnerable to. So in that sense, this could be sort of a new field for them of issues to think about. And I think we'll discuss that there are some emerging risks in this area that are sort of truly novel and that folks might want to develop a better awareness of. So, there are actually some new risks in this space. Does that sound right to you?
That does sound right. And in fact, I would say that this is new not just for nonprofits and board members, but really for-profit companies and as well as practitioners and people in the insurance space. A lot of what we look at as brokers, and certainly in my role as coverage attorney, is the law and how courts have decided certain issues about how insurance might respond to various risks. And as of right now, there are very few cases about cyber insurance risks. And the threat is just so dynamic and so ever shifting that I think it's really kind of new space for pretty much everyone.
Yeah. No, that sounds right. So why don't we step back? When we talk about cyber, that's such a broad kind of amorphous category. And I think when we break it down, we end up talking about kind of more specific risks. So why don't we give listeners maybe an intro or some background on the various kinds of risks we're talking about when we're talking about cyber?
Sure, that's a great idea. And I think when you think of cyber risks, you really think of these big headlines about worldwide events that have happened and these just very disastrous kind of almost what they call black swan type events. But as you pointed out, there are very, very many different risks that will fall under the umbrella of cyber. To kind of name a few, it's really if you look at traditional cyber type attacks. So you've got malware attacks, you've got ransomware attacks, you've got efforts by criminals to kind of infiltrate your computer system. But then when you start to look into this more deeply, there's also privacy risks. So perhaps you yourself as a nonprofit inadvertently disclose personal information, personal health information, payment card information, other things like that don't actually involve an outside cyber intruder, but just involve kind of data and technological disclosure. And in addition to those things, you have a business interruption type exposure. Everybody knows, and I'm sure people have heard this with others that they do work with, is that cloud computing and cloud data storage is just completely spread across the economy, both in the nonprofit and the for-profit sector. And every day I talk to my clients and they proudly state, well, we have our data in the cloud, or we rely on the cloud for this particular application. And that can be great on a day-to-day basis, but it does put another exposure out there. So another cyber risk is what happens if your company or your servers go offline for 3 days. And there are protections out there through cyber insurance programs, which will reimburse for lost revenue. And then a step further, what if an outside vendor that you rely upon experiences a disruption? You can also purchase protection for this contingent business interruption loss. So when we think of cyber, we think of a variety of things across the spectrum. And I think as we'll continue to discuss, you can see that it actually goes into just standard criminal activity as well.
Right, right. And I think when a lot of us kind of lay folk think about cyber risks, we do sometimes think about that criminal side of it, but we think of it when we think about, Equifax hacks or kind of those big, as you said, those hacks that kind of grab headlines. It usually involves kind of personal information or sensitive information, maybe credit card information. And there are definitely some nonprofits who store and deal with that kind of information, and they should definitely be sensitive to that. But for nonprofits that don't maybe store or deal with sensitive information, there are still kind of criminal risks that they should be aware of. And I think that's an area where people don't think a lot about. So why don't we drill down into that a little bit and talk about some of the kind of criminal risks that you're seeing now in both the nonprofit and the for-profit sector that people might not be as aware of?
Sure, absolutely. So everybody's heard the term ransomware, and I think that would be kind of the place to start in a criminal effort that doesn't necessarily involve proprietary information or confidential information. And these type of attacks will seize the servers that a company relies on, or maybe just a network of computers, lock that up, and then the outside actor will demand from the nonprofit, hey, if you'd like to operate today, if you'd like your website to run, if you'd like to be able to use your computer system, you need to pay us $1,000, $5,000, often in Bitcoin. And that puts nonprofits and for-profits alike in a situation where they basically have to pay a ransom to these outside actors. To complicate that more, ransomware can be automated. So there are situations where this is bouncing around for in layman's terms, I should say, bouncing around the net and can hit companies left and right. And there's actually no one on the other side of that. And it's not clear whether it's even a risk. And in those situations, you really need the help of a computer forensics firm to make sure that everything is still working properly. And another area, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that surprises people. It's in nonprofits, especially smaller nonprofits, they'll say, well, why would anyone target us? We're not a big operation. We don't have that much money. How would they even find us? And I think part of the answer to that is that these attacks are becoming sort of a bulk enterprise, or, they're not really targeting sort of high value targets. They're just sort of affecting a wide swath of entities. So that's how people might find themselves being targeted.
Correct. And then the network becomes extensive, and there are different levels where bad actors will accept compensation from other bad actors to just sit there and send phishing type emails all day long to various organizations. And when I talk to my clients, and some of them are nonprofits, some of them are for-profit, and they are dealing with this on a daily basis.
Absolutely.
And it's something that is just very difficult to protect against.
Absolutely. Right. So we mentioned phishing there. Can we talk a little bit about what that means and what that looks like?
Sure, absolutely. So phishing is generally, a popular example, or an example that's been come up a lot in the nonprofit space, is this W-2 fraud. And that is a situation where an individual who works at a nonprofit, and this does happen outside of the nonprofit space as well, will get an email from a board member, let's say, at the nonprofit, that will request a copy of the W-2 form for volunteers, workers at the nonprofit. And that employee will then send those along, assuming it's for some legitimate business purpose, only to find out down the road that it was a fraudster, an impersonation of this executive or this board member who requested the material. And then that information is often sold to third parties who use it for impersonation fraud or stealing identities from those individuals on those forms. So that's one example. Of course, you can imagine where phishing can be utilized in different ways too. Bad actors will use that to get access to passwords, to get into computer systems. It can be used to, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about this as we dig more into some specific examples, but it can be used by outside actors to request employees to transfer money.
Right.
by someone pretending to be an outside vendor.
Yeah, I think a lot of the bread and butter phishing attacks that we've seen is just right. You get an email that looks like it's from a reputable source or from a source that you've dealt with before. Maybe it's your Microsoft Office maintenance, entity, and they say, oh, we just want you to log into your Office account just to, confirm something or whatever. And you click on a link and you go to another page and you put in your login credentials. And unbeknownst to you, those credentials are not going to Microsoft. They're going to some bad actor who's going to try to use that information. So that's like a pretty common sort of phishing attempt that we see. But you're right, they seem to be getting a little bit more sophisticated. And we've heard this term that I think is so interesting, these social engineering schemes. Is that sort of a next level of phishing?
Absolutely. And social engineering is the threat that I hear probably the most about from my clients on a day-to-day basis. And to kind of just walk through exactly what this entails, you start with an outside fraudster, let's call it, and they pretend to be a vendor, basically, of the nonprofit. So someone who supplies furniture or an outdoor tent, or that does maintenance for their utilities or something to that effect. Then by pretending to be this vendor, and oftentimes actually they've hacked into the vendor's system itself, so they are able to utilize either their email system or spoof that system. So you're a nonprofit employee and you receive an email from what you believe to be one of your vendors that says, hello, good afternoon. We are reaching out to you to tell you that we're changing our bank account number. So next quarter, it could be months away, when you're paying your bill to us, just make sure that you send it to this bank account. And then oftentimes, after the employee receives that, they'll receive a phone call. And then they pick it up and the vendor says, you just received an email. I just wanted to confirm that we're changing the bank payment information so that when you guys pay us in 2 months, just send it to this particular number. And we're going to follow up, of course, with a hard copy letterhead authorizing this. And so then the employee might a day later receive something in the mail, or maybe it's an email at this point, but it'll have the vendor's letterhead and it'll reiterate, we've now authorized you to send your payment to this particular banking account number. So when that payment goes out 30, 60 days later, it's actually going to a fraudster, and then it just disappears before anyone even notices. And that really is the classic example of what's called social engineering or impersonation fraud.
And it seems to be a culmination of so many different kinds of other, like, smaller forms of fraud. The ability to spoof the email address and to get all this information to make it look so convincing, and then they kind of create this really elaborate scheme, which is not something that I think we've seen before.
Exactly. And I've even heard examples where an outside bad actor will hack into a vendor, read all of the emails between someone at that vendor and the CFO or an individual at a company or organization, read about the fact that maybe the CFO's daughter has a piano recital coming up, and then use that in the fraudulent communication to try to gain credibility, to try to hide the fact that it's an outside actor, because now you're receiving an email from someone who appears to know you in your personal history. So the sophistication it's pretty staggering, and it's difficult to imagine this type of thing going on because most people don't spend their time allocating their effort to engaging in criminal activity. That this does take a level of creativity and ingenuity that I think is something that really needs to be defended against. And just to touch kind of on another point that you made, where you've got this combination of frauds, I think that is critical, and it's certainly very important from my perspective as an insurance broker, because this type of loss doesn't necessarily sit comfortably under one type of insurance coverage. It is a crime that involves a phone, a computer, wiring money. Oftentimes it can involve a security breach, a cyber hack of some form. So, it becomes a very difficult event to manage, both on the risk management side, but also on the insurance side as well.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I think the social engineering example is so interesting because it is so dynamic and so complicated. It has so many moving parts. when I talk to nonprofits about this kind of fraud, it's sort of the cutting edge or the furthest extreme of what they might be able to expect, and it really gets the wheels turning. Because I think some nonprofits are now kind of becoming aware of phishing, and there's maybe some training at the organizations about, don't open emails from an unknown source, like double check before you wire money. So there is kind of at least a lagged response to raising awareness and to training. And I think that's an important part of risk management for nonprofits, is just having an awareness that these risks exist, and maybe implementing some training at the staff level, and maybe working to see what you can do with your IT systems to make them more resilient to these kinds of attacks. There is definitely a lot of mitigation that could happen. But then, as you mentioned, the other part of this when we talk about risk management is insurance. And so if something, despite your best efforts, does still happen, there are products, there are insurance products out there in the world that can help you recoup any losses that come out of that. And so why don't we talk about that piece of it? When it comes to nonprofits and insurance, a lot of nonprofits don't have cyber policies, or they might not even know what they are or what they cover. So why don't we talk first about what a cyber policy is and what that might cover?
Sure. So a cyber policy, in the most general sense, is protecting your computer system and your data as a nonprofit. And it basically will cover a variety of different types of risks. So the first main category is really information security and privacy liability. So what we've talked about there is, if you have information, maybe a credit card payment number through donations on your website, or various customers, or any sort of payment credit card type information, that would be something that would be a target for outside actors. Privacy in general, this is very broad, where you've got health information of anyone that may be a volunteer or an employee or someone who's participating in an event of some form. There are quite a few exposures that can arise out of the HIPAA requirements of keeping health information secret. And frankly, a lot of those do not involve an outside bad actor. And I know we're focused on crime today, but that's something to kind of point out when you look at cyber coverage is, if you mail a bill or you mail some document to a third party, even if it's completely innocent and that third party immediately tells you, that can give rise to a requirement to report to the government. And you can have the Health and Human Services Department, Office of Civil Rights coming after you and requesting information. So those type of risks carry a lot of kind of weight from both a liability perspective, but also internally. So the policies will respond and help with computer forensics. So you can see, well, did we accidentally put something up on an FTP site and there wasn't an appropriate authentication for people to access it? And how can we make sure that we don't have requirements to notify people about their information getting out there? So that's kind of that is probably the largest area when you think about cyber coverage. And then kind of along that side, I would kind of say, that's really, you can also take the liability piece out of that. So you could face lawsuits from a third party that says, you have now let my payment card information out the door, or maybe my social security number. You can face actions by the government, by local, state, and regulatory entities. And there certainly are, I believe now there are privacy statutes regarding data in every single state. There's the GDPR that just went into effect in May. So there are going to be litigation threats based on information getting out there under, both governmental actors as well as third parties. And to kind of move it from the liability side into the first party side, and when I say first party, you almost can think of it like a fire insurance policy. This is harm that is befallen your organization, and so you want to have reimbursement for that. And those type of things can come up where, let's say you do have to respond where there's been a breach and some personal private information has gotten out the door. And again, we're not talking about trade secrets here. This could just be someone's credit card number or some information related to medical treatment that they received. You have a lot of expenses that can come up there to make sure that those people are notified, such as call centers, forensic experts to get the system more kind of online, or in line, I should say, with what the standards are in the industry for data security. And then I think really the third part, and this is also a first party loss, is what we mentioned before, which is this interruption loss, where your network goes down or an outside network goes down and you're not able to collect donations or you're not able to operate for 2 or 3 days. I have some nonprofit hospital clients, and where a network goes down for even 3 or 4 hours, they might have to cancel elective surgeries for 2 straight days, transfer hospitals, things like that, where these interruptions can cause quite a bit of loss. And cyber insurance, the product is really becoming more sophisticated and broader, and those type of events can recover reimbursement under insurance programs.
So another example that we talked about earlier was if my organization does become the victim of a malware attack, and they lock down my system and demand that I pay some amount of money before they'll unlock it, so I can get coverage for that kind of incident as well.
Exactly. You could get coverage both for the payment and for having a computer forensic effort done to make sure that in the course of the ransomware attack that there wasn't an exposure of private information.
Got it. And then, as you mentioned, we can also have coverage for these more kind of criminal schemes that might involve your computer systems, but that might not strictly be within the confines of your cyber policy.
Exactly. So if you have an event where someone breaches through your security system on your computer network and steals from you directly, accesses information, passwords, whatever else you can obtain through a computer network, that is something that you will see a response for under cyber programs, generally speaking. Now, there is also coverage, and this is where it starts to overlap with traditional crime policies. Now, a crime policy, historically speaking, is been designed to recover where your own employees or an outside actor steals money from the organization. And in that case, the reimbursement is paid to the company for the amount of money that was stolen by the employee. That type of product is now starting to evolve in response to these more sophisticated threats. So for computer hacking type fraud, it can actually be covered under both a traditional crime policy as well as a cyber policy. And along with that, what we were talking about before, you have the social engineering fraud, the impersonation fraud. That is probably actually more covered or more designed to be covered under a crime policy, because originally there were losses, and the companies that suffered these losses told their insurance company, well, this is computer fraud because I received an email from an outside fraudster and I used my computer to transfer money based on those instructions. There have been some decisions in the courts that have said, no, just because a computer was incidentally involved, the human interference or the human involvement broke the chain to make it computer fraud, and there isn't coverage under the crime policy at all. So now when you purchase a crime policy, you want to make sure that you have social engineering fraud, which is a specialty coverage which is added to the policy. And so that is something that would be covered under a crime policy, but also can be covered under a cyber policy as well.
Got it. So I think to wrap up, maybe that's a takeaway for folks, is that on the insurance side of things, the industry is keeping up, and there are products and there is coverage available. But I think for our listeners, for nonprofits, they have to start thinking through what risks apply to them and what they might want to ask about getting coverage for. If you don't know what risks you're worried about, you're probably not going to get the right coverage.
Exactly. And one thing I would say about that process to maybe demystify it is this is really in many ways a collaborative contractual negotiation when you go out and purchase cyber insurance coverage. The underwriters at the cyber insurance companies, or it's insurance companies that offer a cyber product, really will sit down and work with you to make sure that you have threats covered. If you explain specific issues that you have, that can be written onto the policy. There are a lot of sophisticated, the underwriting is much more technical than in other lines of coverage. And where you work to make sure that your network security is up to the standard, where you have your employees trained specifically to call a bank anytime a number is changed to avoid falling for some of these schemes. Those type of things are something that the insurance company looks at and will give you a better price for. It is easier, in my experience, to get some premium relief when you're purchasing a policy on a cyber program if you've done your homework and you have your technological data security up to where it needs to be, or at least are willing to work toward it. And along with that, a lot of the insurance companies that offer these cyber products will pair you with sophisticated computer forensics entities as part of the coverage. So you don't have to go out and negotiate, oh no, we need to make sure that we have our computer system up and operating if there's a suspected event. They will actually allow you to work directly with an outside entity, and you don't have to go through that contracting process.
Awesome. Well, that's a lot to think about for folks, but I'm hoping that, people, it's gotten the gears turning, and that people find this I definitely find this a really interesting space and a lot of interesting issues to think about. So thank you for joining us today, Matt, on our podcast.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. Great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you too. All right. Bye, everyone.